Hey, spiritual extremists, it's Dr. Lloyd-Moffett again in the Blue Star Memorial Temple. And we have behind us the founder of this American line. His name is William Judge. And here's the story. Blavatsky and Olcott start a movement, Theosophy, and it takes the world by storm at the end of the 20th century. Theosophical centers open up all over the US, Europe, and in India. But when Blavatsky dies, the movement fractures. And the American group is led by this guy, William Judge. And he was a direct disciple of Blavatsky and really led the movement, but he only lived for a couple of years. And once he died, the American movement began to split. And we'll follow that trend in just a little bit. But let's return to mysticism, because remember, the mystic path culminates in the mystical experience. And when we look at the mystical experience, that's really what people are saying is in common. And so we are following up on William James's four descriptors of the mystical experience, the things that he thinks are universal in describing the mystical experience. So let's begin to look at those. He says, in the end, the mystical experience is always ineffable. Now, ineffable means it's not describable. It defies expression. It transcends exact linguistic formulas. And all that can be said of it is that it cannot be described. Now, you may not have a mystical experience in your repertoire of experiences so far, but you do know things that are very difficult to describe in human language, moments where you just fall short using our terminology, like the first moment you fell in love with somebody. Like, how do you describe that? How would you describe the color red to somebody who is blind? How would you describe what it likes to have a sexual orgasm to somebody who never has had one? How do you describe rain to someone who grew up in California? How do you, never mind, we're going on a bad path there. But the idea is the mystical experience is so profoundly different from every other experience that people have that inevitably you have a hard time explaining this. Now, there have been philosophers who said, okay, fine, if it's indescribable, then stop talking about it. Because if it is indescribable, you're inevitably going to end up talking nonsense when you talk about it. Listen to a philosopher named A.J. Ayer. If a mystic admits that the object of his vision is something which cannot be described, then he must also admit that he's bound to talk nonsense when he describes it. So, I mean, if it's truly ineffable, then it should be truly ineffable. But you do get the sense that people struggle because they want to share this experience. Let's go back to the Apostle Paul, one of the founders of Christianity. He says, I must go on boasting, though there's nothing to be gained of it. I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up in the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. I know that man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. He heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man I will boast, but my own behalf I will not boast, except for in my weakness. And the inexactitude of Paul's description there is exactly what James is talking about. That in the end, the mystical experience is so difficult to describe. And yet, mystics have devoted so much energy to wanting to share those experiences with people. In fact, they spend so much time that they've often been blamed to spend as much time sharing that experience as having their experiences. But what they do is turn to alternative means to describe this. And so we are going to look now at a series of alternate means. One is simply through poetry. Now, many traditions hold that the most proper way to express things that are difficult to say is poetry. I mean, how much love poetry has been written over the years? How many times has one speculated on death through poetry? The idea here is that sometimes poetry is the right register to talk about these mystical experiences. let's look at a little bit like this in a tradition. So, for example, in the Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition, that is the early church that was in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, curiously, of all the theologians that have ever written treatises in the Orthodox Church, only three are given the title of the theologian. St. John the theologian, that is the writer of the book of John and the book of Revelation. St. Gregory the theologian, a 4th century philosopher and theologian. And St. Simeon the new theologian, who was from the 14th century. Now, many historians have wondered, God, you've had thousands of famous theologians. Why only three get that title? And what historians of the church have recognized is these three men all ended up giving up writing philosophy and theology and ended their careers only writing poetry. They are called theologians not because of their fine philosophical discourse, but because they came to realize that poetry is the only proper means to discuss God. And so in the Orthodox tradition, the highest spiritual experience has always been affiliated with the attempt through poetry to describe that experience to others. So, we find this also in other traditions. In fact, in India in the 15th century, there's a very famous religious figure, a woman named Mirabai. And she would write these love poems because that was the only description of the encounter with God that she could give. So listen to this. Let me give you a taste. Strange is the path of love. Do not mention the name of love, O my simple-minded companion. Strange is the path of love. When you offer your love, your body is crushed at the first step. If you want to offer love, be prepared to cut off your head and sit on it. Be like the moth, which circles the lamp and offers its body. Be like a deer, which on hearing of a horn offers its head to the hunter. Be like the partridge, which swallows burning coals in the love of the moon. Be like the fish, which yields up its life when separated from the sea. Be like the bee, entrapped in the closing petals of the lotus. Mira's lord is the courtly Giridhara. She says, offer your mind to those lotus feet. So what's happening here? Well, James notices that a whole number of religious figures around the world come to the conclusion that if the highest spiritual experience is mysticism, the mystical experience, and that is ineffable, that poetry is the proper register in which to try to convey that experience to others. Now, let's look at a couple of more ways that people have tried.